The 2026 edition of the South Feminist Political Economy Teach-In series has just concluded, and we'll be speaking to Political Economist Dr. Lebohang Liepollo Pheko in just a moment about the talk that she gave earlier on, Decolonising Time, from extraction, Chrono politics to temporal sovereignty. So that's coming up in just a moment. So just as you heard there, Shayla Ndukumana is coming up with African Diaries at 10 o'clock. So let's then talk to that issue that we spoke about. So it was an intriguing talk, listening to it, very educating, and that is as I mentioned earlier on, the 2026 edition of the South Feminist Political Economy Teach-In series. It was the 30th edition. It concluded with political economist Dr. Lebohang Liepollo Pheko leading a cross-regional dialogue under that theme, Decolonising Time, from extraction, chrono politics to temporal sovereignty. And she joins us now to just unpack today's session, what it means just in terms of intergenerational analysis, issues shaping the global south, and obviously what is happening beyond. A very good evening to Dr. Pheko, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you very much.
And you ended the discussion with a beautiful poem about loss, about grief, about consolation, all around the theme that you were talking about. It was quite a moving one. And I want you to just share with us, for those who missed it, why you argue that colonialism doesn't just steal land, it stole time. And in concrete terms, what does that mean in terms of time being colonized?
So thank you so much, Ms. Makwetla, and to the viewers as well. But my arguments are key. The one argument is really that time is a resource. It's a political economic resource. It's not just a nebulous abstraction, and it is not just a figment of our imagination. It is something that it's a commodity that can be spent, in inverted commas, that can be extracted, and that is of great value. It is also something that one group of people, depending on power dynamics, intersectional dynamics. So, for example, white people over Africans, slave owners over enslaved African people, employers over employees, bosses over factory workers, farmers over farm workers, etc., etc. But time is something that can be extracted for value, in fact, for value, right? So time is not free. And what I also suggested, that colonialism reorganized our time pattern. So the ways in which we used to organize ourselves around seasons, for example, around cosmologies, around sun constellations and star constellations, around different rites of passage in society, marriage, death, birth, and so on, and even around daily practices of communion, of community, and of fellowship. And all of this was disrupted with the incursion and the arrival of things like the church clock in different communities, things like the factory clock, the clocking in and clocking out, which completely have, to this day, have interrupted the flows and the rhythms of our lives. And hence, my last hypothesis was that the idea of saying African time is a derogatory sense has to be debunked, because the source and the origins of time are actually on this continent. The Inzalo Elanga, which is based in Mpumalanga, which is the oldest sundial and the oldest known form of time-telling formation in the world. It predates Stonehenge in the UK. It predates the pyramids even, arguably. And I argue that we are the origins and the fountain of time. So this whole idea of African time, black time, you're never on time, etc. Maybe we're never on time because we are still trying to calibrate our own time and find our own rhythm, and find our ways back to our own rhythm.
And you also spoke about the importance of the intersection of memory work in this. To quote you, you said, the effect of it has been teaching Africans or black and brown people that they never did anything. Just expand a little bit more on that, please.
Yeah, so I think the piece on memory work is really important, because one of the great successes, I suppose, of Western imperialism is to convince us that we are a historical people, to convince us that our history and our timelines begins with the colonial invasion, with the settler invasion in the 14, 15, 1600s. And yet we have a whole history, a whole cosmology, a whole humanity, and several civilizations that predate that. The colonial era, the colonial epoch in all of its formations, Tshepisa and the viewers, in this formation is only about 500 years old. And in the grander scheme of our longevity and of our temporal sovereignty, we have been around as civilizations. As I suggest, for example, that these henges in Mpumalanga might have been around for at least 70,000 years. So what this does is that, of course, what European invasion has done is to then lead us to the belief that there was nothing before then. So because we have no memory of ourselves, no memory of what we have done, of our achievements, of our architectural achievements, our cosmological achievements, our epistemic achievements, our mathematical and scientific achievements, for example, our innovations in agriculture, our innovations in technology, even to this day, for example, then it gives the impression of, from number one, dependency on Western world. It strengthens the white gaze, because if you don't have a gaze that is centered in self-knowledge, it is so much easier for us to be manipulated and to bend to the will, bend to the needs, bend to the subjugation, quite frankly, of Westerners, of outsiders. So my hypothesis is very much that memory excavation is a huge part of this, is a huge part of the work that needs to be done. Because if we can't remember a time previous to this, a time different to this sort of subjugation, how then do we begin to even create a compelling case for reparations, for restorative justice? How then do we begin to take our place, in global stages with the confidence and the self-awareness of understanding that the world needs us more than we need the world, the resources that we have and all of that. So memory is such a key part of the reparative process.
And I want to just lean into that, how we also therefore consider what success is. It would be from that prism of how European wealth is built and defined. And you say coerced African labor has actually been converted to what we see as Western modernity. How? So that, those of us who don't know, how would you say in the so-called post-colonial times it presents itself? That time washing.
Sure, well put. So it presents itself in different ways. It presents itself in sound bites that we use regularly, that we've internalized and normalized. Time is money. You snooze, you lose. Walala wasala. We've all heard them, right? Time costs money, and all of these sorts of things. And it normalizes the productivity porn. It normalizes the extractivism. It normalizes speed and haste over quality, over rest. It actually it weaponizes the idea of rest, converts it sometimes into the notion that we are lazy. And of course, one of the greatest ruses of Western capitalism has been to try to convince Black and brown people, non-white people, that they are lazy. And it's an instrument of coercion that suggests that if you rest, if you are ill, if, for example, you have a bereavement to attend to, how many people, I'm sure that many people have been asked, Ganti, how many grandmothers do you have? Another funeral? Ganti, how many brothers and sisters do you have? Another cousin, another brother? When you need time off to go and attend to family responsibilities. This kind of way of almost demonizing our need for rest and to observe family ritual, family practices, and it also turns up in the form of hustle culture. You sleep when you're dead. We're told everybody has the same 24 hours in a day. We know that this is abjectly untrue, patently untrue. The person who's got 2 au pairs, a nanny, a driver, and a chef certainly has not got the same 24 hours in a day as the person who is waking up at 3, 4 a.m. to catch 3 taxis to get to work by 9 in the morning. Those 24 hours are not the same at all. And lastly, this valorization even of working yourselves to death, for example. So the need for the instant, whether it's Takealot, it's whatever, Amazon, we want things now, Netflix, movies on demand. You don't want to go to Stir-Kainako, you don't want to go to the movies anymore. I want it and I want it now. There's a cost to that because there are people behind the scenes who need to be working almost 24 hours a day, or there has to be an availability for us to have this constant on-demand user interface with whatever we want at that moment. And it's consumerism on steroids. To get those clothes from Shein or Temu or whatever, there's a cost that there's to a woman in Pakistan or Vietnam or Bangladesh who has worked all night so that we can get these very inexpensive clothes the next day. So I think that it just shows up in multiple ways.
And I want to reflect on what you spoke about reproductive labor as well, how you spoke about Sibongile Ndashi's work and how it's made women largely or legally invisible. So speak to us about that, and also speak to us about spatial planning. You're saying that has also ensured that Black and brown people are robbed of agency, just in terms of being able to garner better livelihoods, and also how it's robbed future generations of that temporal debt.
Thank you. So the whole notion of social reproduction and reproductive labor means that basically, women are exploited and our labor is often unseen, unknown, it's intangible, or it's unrecognized, unnamed. So it's not things that we do are not often even named as labor. Think about the secretary, the receptionist, the person in the office who is actually more of a counselor. She's everybody's counselor. She's everybody's. She's actually doing the work, half of the work of the CEO, but not getting recognized or paid or remunerated accordingly. Does dry cleaning for the CEO, etc. And globally, this kind of work amounts to about 76% of paid and of unpaid labor that women perform. It also amounts to, if one woman spends 4 hours daily in doing social reproductive work, that amounts to about 29,000 of hours of time. You could do a lot of degrees, you could do how many PhDs with that kind of time, have a whole new career. And in fact, across the African continent, women spend about 40 billion hours only collecting water, Ms. Makwetla, just collecting water. So that doesn't include cooking, caring for children, just collecting water. So what this means is that really capitalism has learned to depend on unpaid and paid labor of women. It has also learned to take it for granted. So this links to things like structural adjustment, neoliberalism, globalization, where the state steps back and doesn't provide the kind of education subsidies, the kind of education infrastructure, the public infrastructure to provide healthcare, for example, care for the elderly, early childhood care, for example. So it always means that this invisible work, invisible in inverted commas, is then passed on to women who are in fact subsidizing the state for free. And then, I think people like Sylvia Tamale, who talk about, and I quote, colonial moral orders that naturalize women's endurance. And in Tshepisa Makwetla, who talks about how this leads to intergenerational exhaustion. Many women are born tired and they die tired. What this also does is we cannot underestimate the life expectancy and the life quality, both of which are highly diminished by this. And of course, Lastly, to say to your point, that Sibo and Dashe makes around the legalizing of women's labor, the legalizing of the work that women do. This was done firstly through the apartheid group, the Group Areas Act and the movement of people, the various legislations that only attached with people's labor and people to their labor, and only gave them the right to be in particular public spaces because they were doing labor for European people, which leads us to your question about spatial planning, where the spatial planning globally. I mean, I've been to favelas in Brazil. I have been to projects in the US. I've been to projects in the UK as well. Spent many years growing up in a council estate in the UK, and I can confirm that the spatial planning there looks very similar to what one would see in any township in South Africa. It is dark. The public transport in this country in particular is often very far or very scattered. We don't necessarily even have a public transport infrastructure, which means that in terms of our spatial planning, it takes us much longer in terms of time. We spend much more time getting from one place to the next than we need to. It takes about 3 times as much time to cut a zip across Johannesburg or Cape Town or Durban or any major metropolis than it would using, public transport, for example. So all of these things lead to this extraction of time and this never-ending cycle of time poverty.
You also spoke about how, the West is becoming more sophisticated in enforced waiting. For instance, you spoke about migrants from Libya and those at the US-Mexico border, that bureaucratic limbo. How does it become a form of time extraction?
So certainly that kind of liminal life where people are basically in transit. You're neither here nor there. You're neither this or that. You're neither a full citizen, nor are you a refugee, nor are you an asylum seeker. E.g., even people who are in the carceral, the industrial carceral system that the United States in particular exemplifies, where you're neither charged or not charged. You're neither in remand, nor are you fully, nor are have you been incarcerated fully, and yet you are detained at the pleasure of whichever authority. I think also when you think about the privatization both of prisons and of migrant processing systems, migrant processing zones as well, and visa processing centers, which are increasingly privatized. No longer do you go to the embassy, for example, of X countries. One can see the very cynical connection between the extraction of people's time, the extraction of people's labor, and this as an industry. So timelessness, right, as an industry. So people who spend years and years waiting in limbo and unable to either pursue an education. You can't get a job because why? You are in limbo. Your status is not yet fully determined or fully finalized. It's an abhorrent way to treat anybody. Better maybe to send them back to where they the way they originated from, with compassion and with dignity, than to keep people in limbo for 5-10 years, for decades, waiting for a dream that may not really be a dream at all.
You also drew on carceral theory to exemplify why, there is a generational compounding. You spoke of the need for a generational audit to show how stealing time is stealing life.
Yes, indeed. So, I mean, the whole notion of intergenerational compounding also speaks to things like education loss. It speaks to things like suppressed assets. It speaks to reduced life expectancy. But it also speaks to the notion that, as I mentioned before, that time theft compounds across generations. So, for example, it manifests in the fact that life expectancy is something that and quality of life are things that we inherit. Tshepisa. There are many statistics in this country and beyond that talk about, for example, stuntedness, that talk about child poverty, that talk about, the fact that the children who don't get a good head start in life, the first 1,000 days, for example, are likely to have a good ending in life either. But what that completely ignores is that children are not these eggs that drop into the household. If you are born poor, you're not born poor and your family are multimillionaires. You are born poor and you're born hungry because your mother was hungry. So this speaks to the temporal continuities of timelessness, of poverty, and how you can literally inherit things like lack. You can literally inherit joblessness. So we're not being overexcitable when we talk about things like structural inequality, structural deficiencies, intergenerational lack, intergenerational poverty, because indeed for many people, it is the dividend of the times that have gone before. And for many people, there is absolutely no prospect of a change in their lives, which is why there is such great joy for many families when you have the first person to finish matric, the first to graduate, because what they have done is that they have borrowed back time, they have borrowed back into the future, and they have then grabbed a future that would not have been accessible to them and made a time shift as a result. So this is really what intergenerational compounding speaks to.
And I need to end on this note because, and I'm thinking of the conversations that happened here in South Africa when we speak of rewriting the wrongs from the past. You say that the issue of time is elongated when discussing slavery. Can you explain to us how and what ways do we need to be innovative when discussing reparations to prevent us being shut down when raising these issues?
So I think the one thing is that time justice also speaks to is really a response to, for example, the kind of dogma that says it happened a long time ago, particularly Westerners and people who don't belong to oppressed groups, or who are not survivors of apartheid, survivors of white supremacy, survivors of racism, and so forth, who want to tell people who are the survivor group that it's time, pelile, we're done with that. 1994 is gone, for example. But we know, for some of the reasons that I've mentioned, that our past remains with us, that we time travel we time travel with our debt, with our poverty, with lack, and so on. So what I'm suggesting, of course, when I speak about this is also to say that this elasticity of time should also be something that we're able to then bank into the future as a dividend into the future. The loss of potential, for example, the loss of futures means the loss of earnings, the loss of ideas, the loss of education, the loss of things that might have been. I'm suggesting that we have to go not only into the past, but also measure how the past is potentially still hampering whatever potential futures we could have. And I think that that's a much more innovative way to view reparations. And of course, lastly, to say that reparations can never and have never been only about the money, but they include financial, respectful, negotiated, and settlements, which should be in community and in conversation with the affected parties. But land as a restitution, land as a reparation, time as reparation, things like a social wage for people who have not been able to have any time, or who have had their educational deprived, poverty deprived, food deprived, land deprived, family deprived, and so on and so on.
Right.
We must find different ways of doing this.
Dr. Pheko, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and sharing those fascinating insights with us. Dr. Lebohang Liepollo Pheko is a political economist, and she was speaking to us about a lecture she gave earlier on at the 2026 edition of the South Feminist Political Economy Teach-In series, and it was under the theme, the dialogue, Decolonising Time, from extraction, chrono politics to temporal sovereignty. And that's how we come to the end of Africa World Hour this evening. Thanks for joining us. Up next, Shailen Dukumana with African Diaries.
Conversations that